My talk is called What's So Hard About Internet Voting? My name's Vanessa Teague, and this is joint work with such a large collection of people that I decided not to put them all on the slide. But everything I'm about to talk about is joint work with lots of other good people, both including both the attacks on systems that we found and also work on designing new and better ways of doing things. I want to start with what I understand as the history of voting research in the crypto community. And it really starts with this paper by David Shom way back in 1981. It's commonly cited as the first paper in voting, but it's really important to understand that it's not actually really a paper about voting. It's really a paper about mixing. And there's one paragraph in the paper that basically says, this would solve the voting problem too. Now, in no way am I trying to diss David Shom, because I know that he subsequently did a whole lot of really good, very detailed work that was specifically about the voting problem. But you can kind of see why the crypto community, having just invented a whole lot of really cool new tools, thought that they had also solved the voting problem. And the first hint that that was really not the case came from this paper, actually much later, right, 1994, by Josh Binelow and Dwight Twinstra. And Josh says, well, look, it's all very well to keep votes private, but when you're voting, you need an even more important kind of secrecy property. Not only that the system doesn't expose your vote without your consent, but also that you cannot prove how you voted, even if you want to. And that's critically important for avoiding both voluntary kind of vote selling and also coercion to vote a particular way. So in some ways, this is really the first paper about voting, because it's the first paper to come along and say, you know, here's a really specific problem that really only applies in the specific context of elections. And really what we find, particularly when we look at internet voting, is that the more we think about this problem, the harder it gets. And the more we understand it, the more we realise things that can go wrong that we didn't think of through the scientific literature. So I think these two papers, way back decades ago, really started a pattern, which was that although we came to understand more and more things about how to solve certain problems, the rate at which we understood things that could go wrong with electronic elections, particularly electronic elections over the internet, really outstripped the rate at which we solved those problems. If anything, I think secure internet voting seems harder now than it did in the 80s. So here's a generic picture of what an end-to-end verifiable internet voting system might look like. We've got, on the far left side, we've got voters verifying their votes with code that they control and can choose, right? So in an ideal system, we'd have some assumption that says the voter can take their own open source code, download it onto any number of devices they like, and they can use that code directly to verify that the vote they made truly encoded the ciphertext they made truly encoded the vote that they wanted to cast. And they get some kind of proof that they can verify themselves. Then in the middle here, we'd like a public bulletin board so that every voter can check that that ciphertext they so carefully made truly is there on the bulletin board, and we need some kind of evidence that everybody's looking at the same bulletin board, so the bulletin board can't lie to people about how it's got, about the collection of votes that it's got, and it can't do things like show one person one version of the board and a different person a different version, or it can't show two different people the same vote and pretend to both of them that that's their vote. So the first thing is called cast as intended. The second thing is called recorded as cast. And then the next thing is an inherently collective kind of a process. After everybody has cast and had recorded the vote they want, we really want to be able to see that all of the collection of votes has been properly tallied. So what I've shown here is a mixnet. And I've shown a series of different mix servers that shuffle, re-encrypt, and prove that they haven't added or substituted or removed any votes as they go. And we'd want those proofs to be posted on the bulletin board so that anybody can verify that the mixing was honestly done. And then we'd want some set of decryption authorities to decrypt the output of the mixing service and prove that the output of those votes really was an accurate representation of what had gone in. So you can see that in the ideal scenario, we'd have a complete collection of evidence from beginning to end, and we'd have the opportunity for any citizen to check their own vote on any code they liked, and for anybody to verify everything about the mixing and decryption process for themselves. So we're assuming here that the voters verify their votes, actually bother to do that check, and then practice that can be problematic. We're assuming that at least one mix server keeps its shuffle secret, right? Because obviously if they all collude together and reveal the permutations that they've applied, then we can tell which voter corresponds to which decrypted vote. And obviously we're also relying on the decryption authorities not to all collude together, or not for a sufficient threshold to collude together and decrypt individual votes. We're relying on them only to decrypt the output of the mixing process. So lots of e-voting protocols look something roughly like this. The Helios protocol looks roughly like this, only it uses homomorphic tallying instead of mixing. The Estonian internet voting protocol looks quite a bit like this and uses the verificatum mixnet by Douglas Wickstrom for the mixing phase. But even if we think about the absolute ideal situation, we already see that there are some potential things that are a little bit more complicated than it seemed. So first of all, I would say that the problems that I'm going to talk about in this talk fall into roughly two categories. Number one, the ideal system doesn't really have the properties, both in terms of verifiability and privacy, that we'd really want for real elections. And number two, the systems that are deployed in practice fall a long way short of this ideal. So let's take the first bullet point first, because in some ways that's the simplest one. So one of my friends who has worked a long way on the Helios protocol said, the first problem with this is people tend to check the bulletin board, but they don't bother doing the Benelo challenge. In other words, they tend to check that their ciphertext has been properly uploaded onto the public list of ciphertexts, but they don't always bother doing the challenge process necessary to interrogate the ciphertext they made and try and make sure that it really does encode the vote they wanted. So in Helios, you actually can't you can't have counted a vote that you have challenged. Instead, you have to make a series of different encrypted votes and then challenge some that you're not going to cast. And the bottom line here is users need to do a fair bit of careful work to verify. And if you don't do it properly, you can be tricked. So there are different approaches to trying to balance the ease of voter verification with the risk that a verification process can potentially make it easy for you to prove how you voted. So the Estonian system deals with this in a slightly different way. They let you open directly the vote that you're going to cast, which makes it a little bit easier to do the verification process. But on the other hand, that makes it a lot easier to prove what's in the ciphertext you uploaded. So then they allow people to revote as a way of ameliorating the coercion problem. But then the possibility for revoting kind of breaks verification, because now you not only have to check that you uploaded the right ciphertext, you also have to check that it hasn't subsequently been replaced by some other vote. So you can see why, if we make a bit of a list of possible shortcomings of that ideal scenario, you can see there are things that you could tweak, but it's very hard to solve any one of these 4 bullet points without undermining something else of equal importance. Okay, so you could usually prove how you voted, and efforts to make that harder generally undermine something else. Your verification, particularly of the long and complex process of shuffling and mixing and decryption and so forth, usually requires considerable expertise. And there's a lot of discussion, 10 years ago or so, there was a great deal of discussion about whether people would trust complicated math that they couldn't understand. Now, in fact, more recent experience suggests that the problem is exactly the opposite. It's not that people distrust complicated maths, it's that people trust any old rubbish that comes from the same screen that they get their fluffy cat videos from. So it's actually the opposite problem to the problem we thought we had. And we can talk about that a little bit later. The third problem, which is what we discovered in the Swiss system, although not really for the first time, to be honest, is that subtle bugs can completely undermine the security property of a system, which is hardly surprising. But I think the thing about voting is that security properties are inherently collective. If you're thinking about a secure system like secure messaging, for example, or many other computations, it's mostly about individual security, and something that undermines the security for 5 or 10% of people really only affects those 5 or 10% of people. Whereas for an election, the possibility for one bug to affect the entire system and everybody who participates in it is huge, because by definition we're doing a collective computation, and something that tilts 5 or 10% of the votes can completely change the answer. Another problem that's really hard and not adequately addressed in the academic literature, of course, is user authentication. Some countries have no meaningful user authentication at all. Australia certainly does not. And other countries have some kind of a public key infrastructure which people are reasonably happy to trust for example, banking or paying your taxes, this kind of thing. But it's not really clear whether that public key infrastructure is secure enough for running such an important thing as an election. In fact, there's a very interesting paper from the Estonian authorities saying that they regard the problem of user authentication as one of the hardest problems that they're trying to solve in making their internet voting system secure. So in summary, in my opinion, we have some very reasonable solutions in a polling place, which I'm going to talk about at the end of this talk. But really solving this problem and making this picture work with usable verification, not being able to prove how you voted, and not having to trust some set of authorities whose behaviour you can't verify, is in practice an unsolved problem. Even in the countries that are basically trying to do a good job. Okay, so now let's look at the second part of my talk, which is to say, in practice, what we find in fielded systems is that often the system used in practice isn't anywhere close to that ideal that we would want. I'm going to start with describing the Swiss internet voting system, and I will say from the outset that the Swiss have what, in my opinion, is probably the best e-voting regulation in the world. The regulation specifies a significant number of important, well-defined security properties, and it describes how the system is supposed to work. In particular, the system addresses this problem that we considered about the difficulty of that Helios-style challenge-based verification by deliberately substituting some trust assumptions. Swiss voters receive a code sheet in the mail, and in paper mail, that is, and the idea is they get a unique code for each voting option. So in this case, I've drawn a referendum question. You can vote yes or no or blank. You send your encrypted vote, which describes how you wanted to vote, and that's set to a collection of control components that receive the votes and are supposed to generate codes to send back to the voter. And the idea, obviously, is supposed to be that as long as not all 4 of these components collude to cheat, and as long as the information in the code sheet hasn't leaked to an attacker, the system shouldn't be able to return the code that the voter expects unless it has properly recorded the vote that the voter wanted. And in particular, this is meant to defend against a malicious voting client that substitutes something the voter didn't want. Okay, then after the control components, it begins to look a lot like the last picture. We have a series of 4 mixed servers that shuffle and decrypt. In the Swiss system, they kind of shuffled and decrypted at the same time. And then we have an announcement of the results. So just to recap the assumptions here, we have to assume that the code sheet stays secret, which is actually a huge assumption when you think about the practicalities of printing them and distributing them and so forth. We have to assume that the voters bother to check the codes, although there's a good argument that that's a much more reasonable assumption for a simple thing like a code than a more complex thing like finding some independent code and double-checking the encryption. We have to assume, and this turns out to be important because this was specified in Swiss law, that the system would not be able to deceive the voter as long as at least one control component and at least one mixing and decryption server were honest. And note in particular, it was supposed to be robust against 3 out of 4 maliciously colluding. And finally, we have to assume that someone verifies the mixing and decryption proofs. And at least at the moment in the Swiss system, that was permitted to be a private bulletin board available only to a collection of appointed auditors. So I should say that this picture was never, or has not yet, ever actually been run. And at the time that Olivier Pereira and Sarah Jamie Lewis and Thomas Haynes and I were looking at the code, this was proposed for use 6 months forward in time in Switzerland. And it was applying for certification for use by up to 100% of voters, and the regulations specified that it had to have this structure and these trust assumptions. Okay, so let's have a look at what happened. Well, we found 2 errors in the maths. We found it was supposed to have a shuffling proof and a decryption proof, and there were 2 bugs, one in the shuffling proof and one in the decryption proof, and both of them completely broke the fundamental security goals of the system. The bug in the shuffling proof related to a trapdoor in the use of commitments. Just a very simple thing in the implementation of Peterson commitments, which allowed a malicious mixing server to generate their own Peterson commitment parameters with a trapdoor. And if they knew the trapdoor, which they easily could because they generated the parameters for the scheme, then they could open their commitments any way they liked. And so even though they were using a very sophisticated and proven secure argument for secure mixing by Bayer and Groth, the assumption behind that argument that the discrete log was hard to compute was not valid, and the commitments could simply be, the attacker could simply commit to one thing, prove some things about that, and then at shuffling time apply something completely different. This is a simple little explanation of a shuffle proof that we generated and proved correct, and you can see it's obviously not correct because on the left-hand side, so I've just, as a demonstration, used 0 randomness for Elgamal encryption, which makes obviously takes away privacy completely, but these are still valid Elgamal encryptions, and you can see that we can prove a correct shuffle of something that starts with messages 4 different copies of the message 149 and produces a different message which is 4 times the message 5297, and we can prove, and you can verify if you have a copy of the code, that this is a valid shuffle when in fact it's obviously not a valid shuffle. And Sarah Jamie Lewis put a whole lot of example proofs and transcripts up at Open Privacy Canada. You can see from that link. So this is completely broken, right? And it completely undermines the fundamental security goals of that e-voting system as they were specified as requirements for use. But this had never been used yet, and nobody in Switzerland was enormously upset because that, of course, was the purpose of having the open public test 6 months in advance. Then we found another bug, which I described in considerable detail in my lecture for the summer school, which related to a weak use of the fiat heuristic, allowing a cheating decryption service to pretend to be validly decrypting, but actually maliciously substitute a vote that looked like total nonsense for something that had in fact been a perfectly valid encryption of a valid vote. And this cheating decryption service could fake a zero-knowledge proof of proper decryption, which verified perfectly well according to the specification, but was in fact completely fake. It would need to collude with a cheating client to fit the fake proof into the mix, but the cheating client wouldn't have to actively diverge from the protocol. It would just have to leak information about the randomness that it had used to build the vote. So in the previous case, for the commitment and shuffling problem, the cheating transcript would have been completely indistinguishable from an honest transcript. In this case, it would have been obvious that something had gone wrong because our attacker doesn't get complete freedom to choose a different valid vote. They only get to turn a valid vote into nonsense. So informally, it would be obvious that something had gone wrong, but formally, it would have passed verification. Now, it turned out that this second bug, or at least a very closely related bug, affected systems that had already been used in Switzerland. Up till now, we've been talking only about a system proposed for use in 6 months, but this bug turned out also to affect a part of the system that allowed a client that was generating votes to prove that it hadn't maliciously encrypted the wrong vote. And it turned out that it was, because of a very similar bug, it was possible for a cheating client to input into the system a vote that was actually total nonsense, but extract for the voter exactly the code that they had expected to see. And this hadn't been picked up in the previous non-open testing and certification process that the Swiss had had in place for the system they were already using. This turned out to be a big deal. And it got a lot of public comment, open debate, and extensive analysis in Switzerland, which catalysed a whole new discussion about how they were going to do internet voting from now on and whether they were going to continue doing internet voting from now on, and a whole huge public extensive examination of how the laws should be improved to avoid this kind of situation occurring again. So that's not the end of the story in Switzerland, but that's the end of this part of the talk about Switzerland. And the important thing to say is the story continues in Switzerland in a huge way with a very big public discussion. So now let me come back closer to home and talk about a very closely related system in my home country of Australia. The state of New South Wales, which is the adjacent state to mine, bought an internet voting system from the same vendor that had sold Swiss Post, the system that they used in Switzerland, or were proposing to use in Switzerland, and had already used in Switzerland. So let me give you a rough overview of the New South Wales iVote verification picture. Remember this ideal end-to-end verifiability picture that I drew earlier in the talk? Let's talk about how New South Wales compares. Well, first of all, for voter verification, we don't have the option for voters to verify their own vote independently with an open piece of code that they control. If they don't believe that the closed source system from a foreign vendor has encoded their vote correctly, they can download another closed source app from the same vendor and query it to ask it whether it lied to them in the first place or not. It doesn't have a public bulletin board. It has sort of a secret list of votes that only insiders are allowed to see. It does not have a series of mixed servers. Remember that the assumption behind the series of mixed servers was that they would not all collude to recover the composed permutation. It has one mixed server, which kind of defeats the point of having a mixed server entirely, because obviously this one mixed server understands exactly what the correspondence between incoming votes and outgoing votes is going to be. It does, however, have, or was supposed to have, proofs of honest mixing and honest decryption, which just happened to be exactly the same proofs that the vendor had sold to Switzerland. Now, we didn't have any opportunity to examine this code, but when the story about the Swiss error became public, the New South Wales authorities mentioned in passing that the same error affected their code as well. And like I said, it wasn't too much of a big deal in Switzerland because the Swiss were putting up for open examination a thing that they were not intending to use for at least 6 months. New South Wales, by contrast, was already using it. Already started receiving early votes for their election, which was going to occur on March the 23rd. I think the journalist Justin Henry summarised the situation perfectly. He said, New South Wales Electoral Commission confirms iVote contains critical cital crypto defect, but declares it unaffected and safe for upcoming election. In other words, we know it's got a serious bug, but we're just going to use it anyway. So they did. They claimed later that they had fixed it during the election period, because why wouldn't you let a foreign company log into your voting server and patch it during the course of the election? Okay, so what about the bug in the decryption proofs? Because that was part of exactly the same code base. And when we learned that the same company had sold the same code base to New South Wales, we assumed that the same bug was almost certainly present. New South Wales didn't see it that way. They put out a press release saying, we hear there's some other issue in the Swiss system, but the New South Wales Electoral Commission is confident that the new issue is not relevant to the iVote system. I was highly sceptical, but of course, since there was no code available for anybody to look at, there was no way to prove either way. If you wanted to see the code before an election, you had to sign a non-disclosure agreement that promised not to tell anybody what you'd found for 5 years, which obviously I refused to sign. After the election, in fact, after the period for challenging the election had expired, the code was made available on much more reasonable terms, i.e. about 45 days, which I was happy to sign. So how did we get to the point where a bug demonstrably present in the Swiss voting system but discovered 6 months beforehand managed to be present in a system that was already running in New South Wales, right? How come New South Wales's transparency laws didn't bring that problem to light in advance of the election instead of during the election? And the answer is because New South Wales doesn't have transparency laws. New South Wales has secrecy laws, right? Not only does the Electoral Commission and the software vendor work to keep the code secret, but the legislation specifically provides for imprisonment for anybody who shares the source code without the permission of the Electoral Commissioner. So I think the fact that this bug went right through a running election is a direct consequence of this very bad law, which means that even people who want to blow the whistle risk jail for doing so, even if they find out how bad the system is. Guess what? Actually, the decryption proof bug was relevant, and as soon as we got the opportunity to look at it more than 40 days after the election, it was immediately evident from 5 seconds of looking at their proof that they hadn't really fixed the bug. They had tried, but they hadn't. And you can download the report from there if you like. It's a very simple tweak of the same attack that works on the Swiss system. So obviously, if the code had been openly available at election time instead of months afterwards, its relevance to iVote would have been immediately provable. As it was, we were suspicious, but we couldn't demonstrate that it was vulnerable. So I think an important thing for the world to take away from these two slightly different stories is that good regulations make a huge difference. Right? Switzerland has really detailed regulations. They specify both very strong properties in terms of verification and privacy. And they also specify very strong transparency rules. At least they do for systems that are applying for use for up to 100% of the electorate. I think one thing that Switzerland has probably taken away from this is that for the lesser levels of certification, they should have really, really strong transparency rules as well. The Swiss system got detailed specific analysis as a result of their specific transparency rule, and it's getting a really deep rethink as a result of the discovery that they'd run something broken that had been certified under their more closed certification system that they'd otherwise had. If they'd made it all fully open for public review earlier, the same bugs would probably have been found earlier in the system that they were already using. And I think the consequences in Switzerland of these bugs having been discovered have been entirely positive. I don't know exactly where they will land. I don't know whether they will decide to keep doing internet voting in the same way, whether they'll decide to keep doing internet voting in a much more restricted way, whether they'll decide that it's too difficult and they've understood something more about how hard it is and they'll decide to discontinue it. But I think overall the application of democracy to the decisions about how to do democracy have been entirely positive. I note that, for example, an open source, publicly owned, locally designed system from the Bern University of Applied Sciences is being revived, which I think is a really good thing. So the contrasting story in New South Wales with otherwise very similar software is pretty stark. So New South Wales noticed there was a problem only because the Swiss transparency rules brought it to light, and they coincidentally happened to have bought the same broken thing from the same company. They ran their broken system right through a real election, either not understanding or not truthfully revealing that it was broken. And they don't seem on any kind of trajectory to improve it. There's been nothing in New South Wales corresponding to the huge open public analysis and discussion that has happened in Switzerland. So Switzerland is having this democratic discussion about democracy. Australia is not. All right, just before anybody on the academic side gets too smug about the superiority of systems made by cryptographers, I want to talk just briefly about a similar kind of bug that we found in a system implemented based on a proven secure system by people who really knew what they were doing. This is the Civitas system implemented by Clarkson and Myers and based on the Jules Catalano and Jacobson paper, which is one of the earliest, best and most widely cited papers in e-voting, and one of the first, if not the first, that came with a really rigorous proof of security of its privacy and verifiability properties. There's nothing wrong with the proof in the paper, and there's nothing wrong with the components that it refers to as it's building its protocol. But there's a really critical misalignment of assumptions between what it assumes in the proof and what is actually provided by the component that it uses. In this particular case, the component is called a plaintext equivalence test, and it's a distributed protocol for assessing whether two ciphertexts encrypt the same plaintext or not, designed for use in a scenario where the decryption key is secret shared among a series of authorities. In the protocol, they need this to be universally verifiable or publicly verifiable. In other words, they need those authorities to produce a proof transcript that cannot be faked, even if all of the authorities collude together to lie. But this component that is referred to in the paper is actually made in a different paper that doesn't claim this property at all. It works in a distributed setting in which the assumption has to be that at least one of the participants is honest, and it shows you how, if you're an active participant in that thing and you assume that you're honest, then the other people can't collude to trick you. But this different model, the difference between assuming that at least one participant is honest versus assuming that even if all of the participants collude, they cannot build a deceitful proof, is a misalignment that actually breaks the fundamental security properties of the system. So I'm going to give just a very brief explanation of why this is so and how it's meant to work. We're trying to test whether two ciphertexts actually encrypt the same message. And what we're going to do is use the homomorphic properties of the encryption system to decrypt the ratio of the two messages. Except we don't want to do it directly because we want to retain something about the privacy of their contents. So what we're going to do is we're all going to work together to raise that message to a random exponent to which we all make a bit of a contribution. And then we're going to decrypt the result. If the two messages are the same, we're going to get 1 to a random value, which is going to be 1. If the two messages are different and at least one participant has honestly contributed real randomness, then we're going to get something that's not 1 raised to some random power, which is extremely unlikely to be 1. So if you're a participant and you know that you honestly contributed real randomness, you should be completely convinced by this process. However, if you're a third party, such as a voter or a scrutineer or a candidate watching this process at the end, you need to check that the participants haven't colluded together to make sure that that random exponent they were supposed to be generating randomly, it actually all adds up to 0. If it does add up to 0, then they're going to be able to get a ciphertext, a trivial ciphertext that is just the pair 1, 1, which is in fact a perfectly valid Elgamal encryption of 1, and they're going to be able to make it look like two plaintexts were equal when they were not. It's really easy to check once you notice that you have to check. You just have to check that this particular ciphertext is not present, and it follows that that collusion did not happen. But this check was absent from the specification and the implementation in Civitas. So this is joint work with Eleanor McBetry and Olivier Pereira. The maths is actually super simple, and it's obvious if you look at the Civitas implementation of this system that all of the authorities, if they all collude to cheat together, can fake proofs that two plaintexts are equivalent even when they're different, and that this can undermine the fundamental security properties of the system. In particular, this allows them, for example, to prove that two credentials are that a credential is valid when it's actually not valid. It allows them to prove that a credential has been used repeatedly when in fact it hasn't been, and so on. So even the very best systems have a brittleness to very subtle misalignments in their assumptions and what they deliver. And again, because voting is an inherently collective operation, these very subtle violations can in fact have catastrophic consequences for the primary security goals of the system. All right, so that's Civitas and JCJ, a subtle misalignment of assumptions that means that if all of the authorities collude, they can cheat, even though if all but one of them colludes, they cannot cheat. But, of course, no discussion of voting would be complete without mentioning the United States. And I think I said already, but I really want to say it again, that many of the systems deployed in practice diverge spectacularly from the ideal. We've seen a little bit of the discussion about Switzerland or Estonia. I've said that New South Wales is another category altogether, and it seems that the United States, of course, has gone out of its way to be special. You should read this wonderful paper called "The Ballot is Busted Before the Blockchain," by Michael Spector and James Koppel and Danny Weitzner. And the main thing to take away from this is, I'm going to read the paragraph out aloud. We find that votes is vulnerable to a number of attacks that could violate election integrity. For example, an attacker can, with root access to the voter's device, can easily evade the system's defences, learn the user's choices, alter the vote. We further find that the network protocol leaks the details of the user's vote, and surprise, surprise, using a blockchain doesn't protect against server-side attacks. We provide an analysis of these faults and find that exploitation would be well within the capacity of a nation-state actor. If you read the paper, you can see they're really being polite about the nation-state actor, and many of the vulnerabilities they found are well within the capacity of an intelligent high school student to exploit. So we see subtle bugs that undermine completely very well thought out and well designed systems. And we also see, at least in my country, in the United States, a kind of shocking gap between even what could ideally be out there and the actual stuff that gets deployed. This thing has been used, like the New South Wales thing, in real elections. So why is it so bad? This is a Twitter thread between Henry de Valence and T. Wilson Brown about why are these systems so much worse than they could be? What is it about the procurement process for e-voting software that seems to invariably result in proprietary code that doesn't work? I should say this question was not raised about votes. It was actually raised about yet another Australian system in use in the Australian Capital Territory, about which we know absolutely nothing, except that their website says they use TLS for protecting votes in transit and at arrest, which I hope they don't. But apart from that, we really don't know. And T. Wilson Brown has said, well, election software is centralised, it's secret, it's purchased by governments and reviewed by inexperienced auditors. I would add that there's a huge problem of incentives here. And I think that the comparison with cryptocurrency is actually really interesting, because if someone figures out how to violate the security assumptions of a cryptocurrency, they typically use it to steal money, and people typically notice. So it's not that the first draft of cryptocurrency code is always perfect, it's that if it's broken, there's a huge incentive to find it out, and it's basically impossible to keep it secret and exploit it at the same time. Whereas for e-voting, unless there's something about the situation that deliberately forces an open, honest, independent examination of the code, there's really nobody in the situation who both has access and has an incentive to find vulnerabilities and make them known. So in some ways, I think that what's happened in Switzerland, and perhaps it's happened in Estonia too, although I know less about the Estonian situation, is that the improved regulations and open discussions are tilting the situation more in the direction of the kind of open analysis that's needed. Whereas what seems to be happening in the United States and Australia is the assumption that by keeping it secret, they can somehow prevent people from finding out how bad it is, which doesn't really work. So I think I mentioned this question about trust, right? Do we have to worry about whether people are going to refuse to trust fancy maths that only experts can truly verify? And I said at the beginning of my talk, and I feel very strongly, in fact, exactly the opposite is the problem, right? So I tried to explain to a parliamentary committee in New South Wales that I was concerned that the iVote system didn't provide any meaningful evidence of whether it had accurately recorded and properly tallied the votes. And a member for an electorate in rural New South Wales said, well, I represent people who cannot easily get to a polling place, and I really like this internet voting system. I really want these people to be enfranchised, which is an entirely reasonable perspective, of course. And I said, well, I'm very unconvinced that this system, or internet voting in general in Australia, is actually enfranchising anybody, right? They're not getting any real evidence that just because they've clicked on a pretty user interface that selects a candidate or inputs a set of preferences, that they've actually cast any kind of meaningful vote at all. And the MP said, sure, but we also don't have proof that someone landed on the moon. So just to be clear, he's not saying that he doesn't believe in the moon landing. He's saying that he believes in the iVote protocol and its outputs, regardless of the fact that it actually doesn't provide any meaningful evidence of anything. Ironically, actually, that famous video of the moon landing was collected in rural New South Wales, so he could have gone and asked an astronomer whether they recall whether or not the telescope was pointed at the moon at the time. But never mind. The point is, unfortunately, the problem we actually have here, which allows the incentives to be messed up, is that people trust what they cannot examine and don't understand. So in summary, for a large number of fine print reasons that I'm not going to read through, internet voting is a lot harder than we thought. I really wish the best to countries like particularly Switzerland that are having a really thorough, really open democratic discussion about it. I don't know how it will end. It might end with deciding that based on their improved understanding of how hard it is, they will stop doing it. Or it might end with improving the protocol to the point where they find it acceptable. I don't see any solution currently in use that meets the needs of security for a democracy that I'm living in. And sadly, I don't see countries like Australia or the United States moving in a positive direction in terms of better understanding. So I think that what we should be doing is looking, not trying to answer the question, how can we make internet voting more secure, but trying to answer the question, how can we make democracy more secure? The huge standout success story for improving election integrity anywhere in the world in the last 20 years is risk-limiting audits of paper ballots used for electronic scanning and counting. And this has been really driven by Philip Stark, but also in joint work with a lot of other people. And he's got it to the point where many states in the United States now mandate, and some of them even actually do, risk-limiting audits of their paper ballots after they've counted them electronically. I think the other huge success story, which is really a success story for the crypto community, is pulsate end-to-end verifiable voting. And there's a whole bunch of systems like the Scantegrity system that I know Alex, Essex and Jeremy Clark were involved in, the vVote system that I was involved in based on Preto Vote, the Wombat system from Israel, StarVote and Election Guard from the United States. These are really, really good designs, designed to work in a polling place and in many cases to combine some fancy maths from the end-to-end verifiability literature with some old-fashioned paper backup so that even if the crypto is broken, you still get a robust evidence trail. But if the crypto isn't broken, you get an extra level of evidence that you can use to check that the processing of the votes was correct, even if you were not standing in the polling place at the time. At the moment, we really only know how to make that work in a supervised polling place. But my favourite current research problem is thinking about whether we could take that kind of attitude to a remote setting and think about it as a way of improving postal voting, right? Could you take a plain paper postal vote record and enhance that with some kind of way of generating evidence that it had been properly received and accurately counted? Okay, so I'm going to finish there and open to questions.